friends, and neighbors. I am happy that you are here today. As we begin our annual Apocalypse series, I would like to invite you to fully partake in this journey of searching for Christ. Each Sabbath, we will look at ways in which Christ is revealed through pop culture and what most people would consider the secular. This month, I'd like to encourage you to search for Christ and fall in love with him again and see how he reveals himself to you every day, whether at work, at home, at school, when you're battling LA traffic. Just try it out. Let's pray. Dear God, let some word that is heard be yours. Amen. Dear God, let some word that is heard be yours. These were the words that were spoken by the Reverend Dr. Fred McFeely Rogers each day as he walked into his television studio as the creator of the longest-running show on American public television. Of course, you and I, and the rest of America, know him simply as Mr. Rogers, the beloved host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. How many of you have seen the program? Raise your hands. Okay. All right, good. I'm in good company. Now, I'll be honest here. The show is actually targeted to, I would say, preschool-age children. So growing up, I watched the show, but by the time I was old enough to remember it, well, I thought it was a little slow. And I know I'm not the only one who felt that way. In fact, there's this one episode where Mr. Rogers pulls out an egg timer, he sets it to a minute, and he says, "Let's see how long 1 minute feels like." And just runs in silence for a minute on TV. There are many other still silent moments, but there was no wasted time, for the man knew exactly what he was doing. There have been many books written about Mr. Rogers. There have been actually other movies about him, but the one that I wanted to focus on today is called Won't You Be My Neighbor? It came out last month. Just for those of you who haven't seen it, bring a box of tissues. The first time, I cried the entire way through. The second time, I still cried. Both times, I did not have the tissue box. Just do yourself a favor and listen to my little piece of advice. I would like to show the trailer now.
A television program for children made its unauspicious debut on station WQED in Pittsburgh. Its host, Fred Rogers.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
I want to tell you something.
What would you like to tell me?
I like you.
I like you, my dear. Thank you very much for telling me that.
You take all of the elements that make good television and do the exact opposite. You have Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Low production values, simple set, unlikely star. Yet, it worked.
Hello. I've always felt that I didn't need to put on a funny hat or jump through the hoop to have a relationship with a child.
He was always trying to get a message across in every show.
A week on death.
What does assassination mean?
On divorce.
Some people get married, and after a while, they're so unhappy that they don't want to be married anymore.
He was radical. I know everyone says that, but he was radical.
They didn't want black people to come and swim in their swimming pools. My being on the program was a statement for Fred.
A neighborhood was a place where, at times that you felt worried, scared, unsafe, would take care of you.
He had a singular vision of kindness and love.
Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all relationships, love or the lack of it. Children have very deep feelings, just the way everybody does. There must be times when you do feel blue. I'm not feeling blue right now, though.
Me neither.
Won't you be my neighbor? Well, I suppose it's an invitation. It's It's an invitation for somebody to be close to you. The greatest thing that we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. Won't you please won't you be my neighbor?
Fred McFeely Rogers was born on March 20, 1928 in Latrobe, Philadelphia. Although he was a privileged child, he lived as an only child until his parents adopted his sister when he was 11. He was also a really sickly child. He had all sorts of illnesses and disease, and he was often kept indoors during the summer because of his childhood asthma. So he was isolated both physically and a sense of loneliness and self-doubt. And this taught him how to be aware of the insecurities and needs of small children. He remembered vividly this childhood, and I think that he never let go of that inner child, and this spoke to his mission of love, self-value, and kindness. Ironically, he grew up in an era where talking about your feelings was not encouraged, and this impacted his lifelong mission of teaching kids how to talk about their feelings and how to manage them. He was a graduate of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He was a lifelong Republican and member of the Presbyterian faith. He had a degree in musical composition, and he studied early childhood development. A lot of varied interests, so much so that his church didn't really know exactly what to do with him, because already he wasn't mainstream. So they ordained him as a Presbyterian minister, as an evangelist to minister to children on TV. Now, at the time Mr. Rogers started out on TV, this was when the majority of Americans, I would say about 90%, had TVs. And the programming, I think, was pretty limited and really awful. The programs that were available to young kids, children especially, were very denigrating and kind of cheesy. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but people are just, they would put on silly costumes, jump around, throw pies in each other's face, and just really act obnoxious. I never got the appeal of programming in the 60s, and in fact, Mr. Rogers did not at the time. In fact, he hated this new medium we call television. He realized that it had tremendous influence over the American people in a negative way, but he also realized its tremendous potential for good. At the beginning, he never intended to be the host of a television show or even appear in front of the camera. He worked on a variety of programs until becoming the host of what we know as Mr. Rogers in 1968. Of course, we remember it. It's slow, simple, constant format that was influenced by his studies in early childhood development. Each day, you entered his neighborhood, he would walk in singing the same song, hang up his coat, put on his sweater, swap his dress shoes for sneakers. He would feed his fish and then have a conversation with you, like he would tie his shoes and ask, "How are you doing with the shoe tying?" And would enable the child to interact with the TV. He would also take you on trips around the neighborhood. He would meet his friends, for example, the famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma, and then you would be whisked away into the neighborhood of make-believe. Now, Mr. Rogers never appeared on make-believe, in the land of make-believe, because it was make-believe and he needed to make that distinction. But make-believe is also an important part of a child's development. And it was here among his puppets that important conversations about feelings and some of the really tough issues that not only children, but that adults, that all of us face every day. And then you would be brought back to Mr. Rogers' house. He would follow up always sing a song. He wrote about 200 songs for this program, and then he promised to see you next time. Deceptively simple, right? Remember, 2 years ago, here on stage, that little Japanese phrase, word I talked about being intentional and hospitable, the one that everyone kind of remembers but doesn't remember how to pronounce. Does anyone remember it? Okay, good. I think, yes, good. Omotenashi. Well, you can forget about that one now, because this blows it out of the water. Hospitality doesn't even begin to describe the amount of thought, the amount of love and intention Mr. Rogers had for his program and for his fellow human beings. Or just to give you a few examples, the puppets. Daniel the Striped Tiger, Lady Elaine, King Friday the 13th. Each of these puppets were people in his life that were significant. Daniel the Tiger was named after the lady who had given him the tiger, Mrs. Daniels. Lady Elaine was actually his sister, sometimes a little aggressive, a little assertive, there we go. And King Friday the 13th. Now, he intentionally named him Friday the 13th because, as Americans know, Friday the 13th is a superstitious day. And he didn't want kids to associate that superstition, so King Friday the 13th, every time it was Friday the 13th, he would have a birthday and a birthday party. And this is how intentional he was about the little details of this program. When he got in front of the camera, it wasn't, "Hey boys and girls, how is everyone today?" He would always envision one child, just one child. And he would speak through the television through that one child. He was speaking to you. He was speaking to one person. And he often referred to this distance between the child and the television screen as holy ground. Mr. Rogers was there to befriend each child as though they were the only child out there to befriend. And it was like carrying on a conversation with a friend or a neighbor. Like previously mentioned, he would just ask questions on TV, sometimes reply, give you time to reply. And then there was his mission. Love your neighbor and love yourself. And it's okay to talk about your feelings, and your feelings are manageable. And he would always end his program with some version of these words. I like you just the way you are. You always make each day such a special day. You know how? By just being you. There's only one person in the whole wide world like you. That's you yourself. I'll be back next time. Bye-bye. You are special, just the way you are. Think about this. This was the radical side about him. When he started his program in the 60s, kids were already being bombarded with a ton of advertisements. The child was all about the person he would become, the potential consumer he would become. On the other hand, this was the golden age of televangelists who were forcefully and constantly reminding us how we had failed to measure up to God's standards and that we needed to repent to go to heaven. Mr. Rogers' message was completely counter to any of this. You are special, just the way you are, and that you matter now. Also in the kingdom come, but you matter now. You see, Mr. Rogers understood the inner drama of children, that they needed to feel safe, that they were small in this terrifying world, and that they were afraid of things both rational and irrational. like getting haircuts. I don't know if you've ever seen a child trying to get a haircut. It is terrifying. Or the more irrational fears like going down the bathroom drain. Who would have known? I'm going to keep that in mind next time I interact with a child. And he also understood that anything happening in the world, anything out in the news and the adult world, would also affect children. And so through this world of make-believe, which of course he never appeared in, the puppets and the adults would have crucial dialogues about anything and everything. And I mean everything. They addressed feelings of anger, how to stop those, fear. They talked about segregation, talked about death, about divorce, about assassination. At one point in Make Believe, Daniel the Striped Tiger asks one of the other, Lady Aberdeen, one of the characters, "Am I a mistake?" Talk about radical. But of course, in the program, he always managed to calm those fears. They would talk about it for a little bit, and then they would burst out into a wonderful song, a duet, and say, "Hey, you can talk about this later." Then they would go back, of course, to Mr. Rogers' house, and he would have a follow-up conversation. In this program, he never mentioned God. It wasn't like if you've seen VeggieTales, with Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber at the end, God made you special and he loves you very much. Like, that's an important message, but that wasn't Mr. Rogers' message. He wanted to reach a broader audience that needed to hear his message of love and acceptance. So he sought ways to seek marginalized audiences, and he didn't mention God. And I always found this a little puzzling, because again, he was an ordained Presbyterian minister, lifelong church member, never changed his faith. And he also sought to find an audience in those who were historically marginalized. And one of the ways he did this was through one of his cast members, a young black actor named Francois Clemens. There's a photo of the two of them. Now, Francois Clemens, when he was approached by Mr. Rogers to play Officer Clemens, he initially thought to himself, "Why would I do this? I'm a cop." He wants me to play a cop. I am afraid of cops. Cops, for certain people, were not safe. They were not friendly. But of course, when Mr. Rogers asked you to do something, you couldn't really say no. And so after a while, he agreed to play the role of Officer Clemens. And he's actually one of the first black actors with a long-time recurring role in a children's television series. In this scene here, Mr. Rogers is sitting in a waiting pool on a hot day, and he's cooling his feet. Officer Clemens comes out, and Mr. Rogers invites him to join him to cool down his feet in the same pool. Now, if you remember the clip earlier or the trailer I showed you, there was a clip where there were people in a swimming pool, a mixed-race swimming pool, and there's this angry guy, and he's putting, I think, cleaning agents in the swimming pool in an attempt to segregate people. Mr. Rogers would have none of this, and so by inviting Officer Clemens to join him to cool down his feet, the contrast of their skin, the color didn't make a difference. I don't have the actual clip, unfortunately, but when you watch the film, you'll watch this scene, and at the end you can see Mr. Rogers look up and stare at the camera with this very intentional look. Like, I've never forgotten that. But I do want to play you a clip that happened about, I would say 25 years after.
I was just talking with my television friends and thinking about many different ways of saying I love you.
Singing is one of my ways of saying I love you.
Oh, I know that. Do you have time to give a song to my friend and me?
I sure do. There are many ways to say I love you. There are many ways to say I care about you. Many ways, many ways, many ways to say I love you. There's the singing way to say I love you. There's the singing something someone really likes to hear. The singing way, the singing way, the singing way to say I love you.
Cleaning up a room can say I love you. Hanging up your coat before you're asked to do it. Drawing special pictures for the holidays and making plays.
You'll find many ways to say I love you. You'll find many ways to understand what love is. Many ways, many ways, many ways to say I love you.
I'm so proud of you, Francois.
Oh, thank you, Fred. I like being a human being right here and now. Well, I guess I'm going to have to get back to work.
I always like it whenever you have time to visit with us. Can I help you here?
Thank you.
Powerful scene, powerful scene. Of course, this comes, after about 25 years from the original 1960s version. And by that time, Officer Clemens and Mr. Rogers had developed a friendship. There are a lot of interviews out on YouTube and other places. I would encourage you to look for when Officer Clemens talks about how when they were talking, on the show, Mr. Rogers would always say, "You're special, I like you just the way you are." And one day, Mr. Clemens came to the realization, he said, "Hey, you're talking to me, aren't you?" And Mr. Rogers says, "Yes, I've always told you this, but today is the first day that you heard me." He had been through the show telling him that he loved him, and Mr. Clemens goes on to say, "No adult man had ever told me that he loved me." We don't say I love you enough to the people around us, to the people who matter. But they developed this lifelong friendship. And of course, Mr. Clemens had his own successful career. He was an award-winning musician. All of that you can Google and research later. I know I have to skip over so many of the stories, so many of the amazing relationships, amazing encounters that Mr. Rogers had. And he was also an advocate for children's, TV and public broadcasting. You can Google this too, or watch the film, but there's a scene in which the government wants to cut funding for public broadcasting to fund the Vietnam War. And there's a scene where Mr. Rogers goes to Congress and testifies in front of a pretty mean senator. But it's this fantastic scene where you just see the senator's heart changing, and he kind of just melts. And at the end of the day, Mr. Rogers has secured $20 million in funding, which was a lot back then. But these encounters, he had that way of touching people. He had that gentle way of moving people. There were, of course, a lot of parodies in the show, or because of the show. If you watch, Saturday Night Live or other shows, they would kind of mock his gentle behavior. And he also went on like the Tonight Show, Late Night Show. And it's really interesting to see how he's interacting with these comedians who are kind of trying to poke fun at him. But by the end of the interview, they're listening to him sing a song to them. Like it's wonderful, just like this touching power of just gentleness, kindness, love that truly, truly can change people. He has been described as the kind of gentle, fierce peacemaker intent on creating other peacemakers who would help establish God's peaceable reign right here on earth. I agree. All in all, he produced about, I would say, 900 episodes that aired from 1968 to 2001, right before 9/11, actually. And of course, at his death in 2003, he died of stomach cancer. People wanted to know, was he the real deal? Was he really the person on TV, on the camera, as he was in his private life, behind the scenes? When the director decided to make this documentary film, people begged him not to make this film because they didn't want this perfect image they had of Mr. Rogers ruined. Of course, there were rumors that he was a Navy SEAL, that he wore a cardigan every day because they covered up tattoos. All of these urban legends. If you go to the Navy SEALs website, they actually have a section addressing this. No, Mr. Rogers was not actually ever in the Navy. There are no tattoos under those cardigans, but all sorts of rumors. Was he the real deal? Absolutely. And even better, according to people who knew him, he actually had a really, really great sense of humor. And he received almost 1 million letters from children all across America. Those are archived at the Fred Rogers Center. But he responded to every one of them. Can you imagine getting almost 1 million letters and corresponding to those children who loved you? Like, I wish I had written a letter. I didn't know I would have gotten a response back. His sons describe him as growing up with the second Christ as his dad. And of course, he disciplined, but when he disciplined, he would often use his puppet voices, Lady Elaine disciplining the kids, when he wasn't so Mr. Roger-like. But Christ is the second dad. And coming back, it all goes back to Christ. I think in watching this movie, it goes without saying that this is one of the best examples of someone who aspired to be like Jesus. His mission, his radical message of love and inclusion, and his emphasis on that one-on-one relationship. A relationship, of course, that is based in the love of Jesus, and a relationship that Christ himself longs to have with each and every one of us. In the Bible, Matthew 18 talks about those who are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I'm reading from chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. At the time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, the adults around Christ were always trying to one-up each other. They were always trying to justify themselves. But Jesus would have none of this. He called a child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Look how important children are in the eyes of Jesus. But he also welcomes us to become like children. Because look at Jesus and how much he loves children, how much he loves the adult children in us, how much he loves all of us. He talks about how precious kids are, how the responsibility to them is not to be taken lightly, but he also talks about each of us going back to that state, returning to that vulnerable state when you could take kind words at face value, when you were humble, and when you could trust people. And even if people hurt you sometimes, you could bounce back and know that you were still loved. To race home after school so you could catch Mr. Rogers' show. To be part of that neighborhood. After 9/11, Mr. Rogers came out of retirement briefly to host a special issue because people were hurting, and oftentimes in our country, when people are hurting, when bad things happen, there's a surge in video watches of Mr. Rogers' show because people want to know that goodness. They want to be reminded of that goodness. And in this special issue, remember, he never really mentioned God in his program. But in this special issue, he said that we are all called to be tikkun olam, to be repairers of creation, to repair the beautiful things that God has made that have in this world become broken. We are to be repairers of creation, tikkun olam. And when he was a boy, and he would see all the scary things in the news, he said that his mother would say to him, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." This clip, again, in one of the many, many shootings, I can't remember which one of the mass shootings, there was a surge in people who were watching this video and listening to the words that we so need to hear. Mr. Rogers gives us hope that there are more people in the world like him, that there are helpers in this world, that there are people who want to help, that there are people who are actively helping, and there are people out there who strive to be like Christ, who want to make this world a better place, people who want to help, and people who want you to be part of their neighborhood. I know I'm not doing Mr. Rogers justice. In my research, there were so many fantastic things, so many special relationships, interesting stories, and things to discover. And I feel that our quest for Christ should be the same way. We want to learn more, and we want to get to know about him. We want to love him more. We want to know about others' relationships with Christ and spread the good news. Find people to join our neighborhood, to love our neighbors and love yourself, to love God. Of course, there is conflict in every neighborhood. But as Mr. Rogers puts it, love is not a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun like struggle, To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and now. How can we invite people into our neighborhood? How can we make the world a better place? Well, I'd like to start here right now. I'd like to end by doing this little exercise some of you who have watched this documentary will recognize, for it was one used by Mr. Rogers himself. Would you take just 30 seconds to think of the people who have helped you become who you are? Those who have cared about you and want what is best for you in life. Just take 30 seconds to think about those people who have helped you, who have cared for you, and want the best for you. I'll watch the time. Whose face did you see? I hope you will find the time to tell that person how special they are and will continue to be in your life and in your neighborhood.